Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, April 7th, and what's on your mind?
Chaos, civilization ending chaos.
Really?
Well, I guess you could say that's true. I mean, that's actually not the way I've been thinking, but on reflection, maybe that is what I've been thinking about. It's just, the turmoil in the markets following the imposition of the tariffs and, the continued threat of major war in the Middle East. The horror that's ongoing in Gaza and West Bank. And the West Bank, we shouldn't forget about that. None of these crises. We've talked about the military crises, the wars, and now we have an economic crisis on top of it. Or certainly, it appears that we have one. We will see how the underlying economy, survives this imposition of tariffs. But we're just looking at the initial reaction of the markets right now, and it isn't good.
With these military crises, do you feel like they are escalating rapidly at this point, that we are in a dangerous situation, more dangerous than just a week ago?
In the case of Ukraine, I wouldn't say that. There hasn't been a dramatic change. We're just on the Russia continues, to advance. There hasn't been any either acceleration or deceleration. There was a slowdown. There was a continual acceleration really through most of 2024 in Russian advances, and then that slowed down somewhat in the early months of this year. But it appears that they're starting to accelerate again. Still below where we were, let's say, in November of last year. But it seems that they're starting to advance faster once again. And so that's no real dramatic change in Russia, except, the thing, there is a potential, of course, there, because there is this continued talk, about major Russian offensives, at least one, probably more than one. And as I said earlier, I've heard talk of this for a long time, but it just seems like there's more talk of it now, and there seems to be almost a consensus that it is going to happen. We'll see. If it happens, it'll probably be about a month from now.
Okay, and then in the Middle East, how dangerous are things right now? I mean, I've been seeing that the Iranian army is on high alert. I saw something on Twitter about talks about going in on the ground in Yemen. The only way to defeat the Houthis would be going on the ground. What's going on?
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll mount a ground offensive in Yemen or in Iran, for that matter. I mean, I think Trump understands how unpopular those kind of wars are, and he himself dislikes them. I don't think that he's going to take that. He wants to do things, through the air. Air wars are popular in the U.S. You get dramatic footage and very few, if any, casualties on the American side. The problem is that they rarely achieve their objectives. You can't really subdue a nation or, defeat a country just through air power. And that's always been true. It was true even in World War II. I guess you can make an argument about the atomic bombs then, but I think actually the majority of historians argue that even there, it wasn't the atomic bombs that ended the war. It was actually the ground invasion by the Soviet Union of northeastern China. So yeah, you can't really win a war through the air, but it's popular, and I think that's the way it's going to be. There is continues to be very worrying signs about an impending war in Iran, against Iran. You mentioned that the Israelis were on high alert. I know
No,
that
it's the Iranians.
okay, okay, that's what I was going to say. It was the Iranians, and I think they've essentially authorized their local air defense commanders to shoot down incoming objects. Say you don't have to get approval from higher up the chain. If you see a foreign aircraft heading into Iran, it's in Iranian airspace, you can make the decision right then and there to shoot it down. So they're on a hair trigger right now.
What is the objective for the United States and Iran to begin with? Regime change? They expect to do that with a couple of bombings? What's the plan? Is there a
Yeah.
plan?
Well, the main justification is the Iranian nuclear program. Now, again, it has to be emphasized that they do not have a nuclear weapons program. I mean, the worry, to the extent that it's real, is that they have what's called breakout capability, and they can, in a very short period of time, actually convert the civilian program into a nuclear weapons program, produce a nuclear weapon, and load it on a missile and fire it. It may be like before they. This is what I've heard. I don't know how true it is, but that it used to be that it would be at least a year. Their breakout capability required at least a year from let's say, withdrawing from the NPT to actually developing a usable nuclear weapon. But now we're talking about a month or two. And why does that happen? Again, this is the infuriating thing. It's the threats against Iran that have pushed them to this point. It's just if the constant attacks and threats against Iran have motivated them, to reach this point, this threshold where they are, because they understand, it's just like diplomacy has failed. There's just absolutely nothing seems to deter the Israelis and their American backers, from their aggressive behavior towards Iran. So the hope is that, maybe the threat of nuclear weapons can deter them. Now, of course, they haven't taken that step. And I believe that if we pulled back and we actually, let's say, pursued a policy of negotiation, peace, and cooperation, if we had stayed in the JCPOA, this just wouldn't have happened. But we tore it up, and then we pursued. Trump assassinated the General Soleimani, and we know about the assassinations carried out by Israel. There's Israel's support of terrorist attacks within Iran, and the constant threats. And then not to mention like the attack on the consulate in Damascus and so on, which was clearly an act of war against Iran by Israel. So all of these things have pushed, I believe, the Iranians to actually consider, at least, to go to this threshold. Now, they may never go beyond it. It's not that they are incapable. Clearly, they have the scientists, they have the technology to make a nuclear weapon, but they have held off from doing it. It's something that they could have done probably, 20 years ago, but they've held off from it. And the reason that they're so close, and I think there is even, a serious consideration of it now, is the constant threats. And, you have to see it's logical on their part. They look at a country, again, like North Korea, and compare it to Libya. There was, both of those countries were on a path to develop nuclear weapons. We continue to threaten North Korea. The North Koreans just doubled down and they developed a nuclear weapon. And now they're safer. And everybody knows it. It's like, okay, there was a real risk that North Korea was going to be attacked, but no longer, because they have the big weapon. Libya, Colonel Gaddafi made this agreement to actually denuclearize. And a few years later, he was brutally murdered in the streets, right? And of course, Iran and other countries look at that and say, well, let's have an honest conversation here. What should we do? These people are out to get us. Maybe they may still, no matter what, not do it. There has been real resistance from Ayatollah Khamenei, and he may just keep, persist in that. But when presented with this constant threat, this constantly escalating threat, and it looks like again, an attack may be imminent. It's just natural that they're going to respond, in this way. And if indeed we carry out a large-scale attack on them, that might be what it takes to push them over and get a nuclear weapon. Now, again, this is all very, ironic, because the stated objective is to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. But this is what I think the reality of what we're looking at here.
So do you think that if Iran developed a nuclear weapon and then demonstrated the capability of it, they tested it, and the whole world sees it, that would make Iran safer? And if that's the case, then why don't they do that? Because clearly it worked for North Korea, like you said. If you want to
Right.
avoid a conflict, then Israel will finally have to pipe down because they know that, okay, they could nuke Tel Aviv if they really wanted to.
Uh-huh. Right. As a deterrence, right. Well, yeah, I'm sure there always been people in Iran that have argued that point. On the other hand, I, their partners like Russia really doesn't want them to do that. There are strong advocates both inside Iran and of outside Iran. Particularly in Russia, who say we really don't need more nuclear weapons. That if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then the Saudis, for example, will be motivated to get a nuclear weapon, and it's just the whole Middle East is just going to become an even more dangerous place. That's I think one way to look at it. And then there's also just Iran could get a nuclear weapon, but when it becomes clear, like when they withdraw from the from the non-proliferation treaty, which is what they would do, prior to actually producing a nuclear weapon, that would be a highly vulnerable point. Now, again, so I think that's something that they would be reluctant to do. That would be, kind of a signal to Israel and the U.S. to attack. But now if Israel and the U.S. attacks anyway, they take that away from them, right? There's that concern. Okay, they've already attacked, so why not? Yeah, I think that's one of the great dangers here.
So you think that if there's going to be an attack, and you think that do you feel like it's more likely now? You've talked about it before. We've said a lot of analysts are thinking that, yeah, this might really be the time. I know you don't want to give any solid predictions, but it seems like we're still moving further and further along this path of attacking Iraq.
I'm afraid so. I mean, I haven't seen any any meaningful indications otherwise. It seems to be that we're still on this track, and that we very well could. We I don't know, probably, will attack. Again, it's just that it's hard for the U.S., for Trump now to back down when he's made this threat, and he's repeated it a few times. It's going to. He's really invested in the prestige, the credibility of the U.S. in this.
He was all about no more wars. This is so crazy how quickly that this could have just turned around.
Right.
I think a lot of people that voted for Trump are probably wondering, like, whoa, what's going on now?
Yeah.
We were about, America first, and these wars, stop spending all this money.
Right. Well, he's always had a bee in his bonnet about Iran. And he's always been very closely aligned with the Zionists, and I think that was always, as many people pointed out, has been an exception to his general MAGA philosophy. His America first. People will joke, no, it's really Israel first, and I think that's what we see. If it really was about America, putting America first, we wouldn't be doing this. But it is unfortunately the intrusion of an Israel first thinking into the administration and into the mind of Trump himself that's always been there. That explains the anomaly.
But he has to understand that if we do some type of bombing campaign, you can't just bomb Iran and go home and call it a day, right? I mean, like, we were able to do that in these other countries. Israel's doing it in Syria. We see it in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan. But we can't do that to Iran. They have capabilities. They have very powerful allies. They can bring down the global economy that's already reeling from Trump's tariffs within closing the Strait of Hormuz or blowing up oil fields or whatever they need to do.
Correct.
They can bring down the whole global economy. So, do you think he's aware of that? Or does they have so much hubris that thinks that, we'll fly over with a couple of B-2 stealth bombers, drop them, and, I don't know, take out some nuclear facilities, and Iran will be like, I guess you got us. I mean,
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, A simple answer is yes. That not that he's aware, but yes, that's the way he thinks. That he is a believer in American supremacy, preeminence. He's still living in the past the way Biden was. We've talked about it. Biden felt like, heck, we can wage all these wars at once because we're the United States of America. That's kind of supposed to be the end of the argument. And unfortunately, though Trump has discarded most of the neocon thinking, he himself is, a hegemonist. He I think has that same faith in American power, and we're seeing it actually both on the military, front and also on the economic front. Because I think that the sense is that, well, the whole world absolutely depends on us. So they're just going to have to bend to our will. I'm talking about economics right now. So we can impose these tariffs, and they're just going to have to accept it, and they'll have to beg for mercy, or if they don't, they're just going to receive their punishment, and will equalize out, equalize trade in that way. But again, I think in both cases, whether we're talking about the military or economics, he's vastly overestimating U.S. power. When it comes to the military, that we had our unipolar moment back in the 1990s when we didn't have any rival. But our economic power has been in steady, relative, not absolute decline, though in some sense it's absolute too when you're talking about manufacturing, but in a relative decline relative to the rest of the world for decades and decades. And we're just not, we don't have that, the kind of dominance in the economic sphere that we once did. What I've heard is that we only account for about 13% of market demand in the world at this time. So yeah, we're an important market, and especially for some countries, certain countries really are highly dependent on us. Canada and Mexico for obvious reasons, but they've already negotiated lower tariffs, so they're not being subjected to the same very heavy, punitive tariffs that the other countries are. But anyway, the world in general, if you look at the whole world, we're only, we only account for 13% of demand. So a lot of, the world actually can go on without us. And I think this is something that he doesn't understand, and and then when it comes to Iran and the military, it's just, I think he is also living in the past. I'm sure there are people, they've always been there, that are trying to tell him, hey, be realistic. This is not, this is not like attacking Yemen or Iraq. Even they can fight back. Even if we limit ourselves to the air war, they can fight back in the air very effectively. I'm sure there's some people who are trying to tell him that, but there have always been these Iran war hawks in the U.S. government, and he brought in some new ones too. And so there are people who see this as their chance, to have the war that they always wanted. And I think, these people are just fundamentally, they're warmongers, and I think they have to know at some level that it'll be a very destructive war, and that, but they want to do it, and they just are, have this visceral loathing for Iran, and this desire to, that they share with Netanyahu. Some of them are just, it's purely kind of an ethnic loyalty, but others it's just an ideological kind of alliance with Netanyahu. They want to destroy Iran, and they've wanted to do it for a long time. And even if they know there's going to be a high cost, they don't care. They see it as their opportunity now, and I'm sure they're pushing Trump to do this.
I saw on X that we are boosting our troop presence heavily in the Middle East. Do you know anything about this? I heard something like 300,000, but I don't know if it's true. So that's what I wanted to check with you.
Yeah, boy, that would be hard to believe, honestly, 300,000, because I think we have fewer than 500,000, what I read recently, in men under arms, or and we're actually talking about cutting at another 90,000. So yeah, that's hard to believe, and I
It
haven't
could
heard
be
anything.
wrong. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have no idea. But yeah, I just saw some footage of a bunch of American troops and these planes being flown over, but I don't know if it's
yeah.
from
There's no
some other
question
time.
that, yeah, no question that refueling tankers and bombers have been deployed to the region. I mean,
Do,
when you say Diego Garcia, that's actually a long ways away. That's over 2,000 miles away, but that does put them within range, and that may be actually. I think that actually shows a certain respect for Iran. It's like they know that the air bases in the Persian Gulf could very quickly be destroyed by Iran. But Diego Garcia is outside of Iranian range, so they can launch their bombers from there, and of course once the bombers arrive in Iranian airspace, you will see what happens.
can Iran strike Diego Garcia?
I don't think so, or it would be very
I
difficult for them.
I was asking. I was using Perplexity as just asking AI.
Okay.
I think that they have some drones that can make it out that far,
Uh-huh.
and potentially something called like the Karma Clar Force. I forget. I don't remember the name, but some missile that has a range that is close to it, and they could use a lighter payload, a lighter version of it that could reach it. Suppose I don't know, but
Yeah.
who knows? Also it's a gamble. Just we what we see is that countries don't show all their cards up front.
Right.
Anyways, we don't know that potentially they have longer range strikes because they have never had a need to strike further than Israel. And with the help with Russia, I wouldn't take that gamble. If they have drones that can at least reach there, they could swarm Diego Garcia with drones. I just think it's risky.
Oh yeah. Well, no matter what, it's risky. Even if they can't reach Diego Garcia, like I say, once those the aircraft arrive in Iranian airspace, it's a whole different story. I think they clearly can strike those aircraft.
Right. Well, what do you think our American troops are thinking? You think that they are questioning, like, why are we doing this? Are we going to die for Israel? Like, do you think that enters their mind? And is that a big problem potentially for, because we talked about in the previous episode just about the motivation, that for Americans, for people, for the Iranians and the Houthis, Palestinians, they have a very strong motivation. And if we try to
Yeah.
attack places like China, it's like, you're invading our country. This is
Right.
the problem. For
Right.
Americans, you said they have
Well,
this constantly changing objective. It's kind of
right.
unclear what we're doing. Is this worth dying for?
Yeah.
So do you think that's
Well, I
that's
think that's certainly true in the case of a ground invasion, and we've seen that in the past. But if you have a successful air attack, or then in general our air wars have not been costly. Again, Iran might change all that. And it hasn't been costly. For example, in Yemen, we keep on, firing missiles at Yemen, but we haven't suffered, and we've killed quite a few people there, but we haven't suffered any casualties ourselves. So, unfortunately, a lot of these people they think, well, there must be a reason for this. They told me to get up, go up to certain altitude and fire a missile at certain coordinates, and I did it, and they just kind of assume that there is some great plan that needs to be followed. Well, they're following it. Now, it's interesting in the case of Yemen. Of course, the Houthis have shot down a number of Reaper drones, and some people have commented that actually, if you look at how the Americans are even showing respect for, the Houthi air defense ability. They're not flying directly over, but they're firing their missiles from outside of Yemeni airspace. Now, if that's true, and it's true of Yemen, you can imagine, how that should be 10 times, the air defense of Iran must be easily 10 times better than what Yemen has. But Yemen, apparently has sufficient air defense to cause the Americans to be very, very cautious.
yeah. I mean, well, I'm also just thinking about all the thousands of troops that are in these bases, like in
Yeah,
Iraq, around there. They're just sitting there. They got to be thinking at some point, like, what are we doing here exactly? What are they being told? What is their
yeah.
purpose? Like, are they being told? Do they have an objective, a goal, a plan? Like, surely they have to be thinking. Are we just
Oh,
sitting ducks for just as a tripwire? Like,
yeah, I'm sure a lot of them are questioning. I know, for a fact sometimes you find the strongest opponents of the U.S., let's say, military policy, of U.S. Initiated wars among the U.S. military, among U.S. military personnel. That's been true for a long time. I mean, in fact, I know some people like that. That used to be Marines, and they're just completely opposed. They've seen things with their own eyes. So you have a lot of people, a lot of idealistic young men. We've talked about a lot of people looking for meaning in their life. Want to serve their country and whatever, and they get out there. Whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, and after a few months, they say, "This is not what I was told. What are we doing here?" It's just it, and they become supporters of people like Ron Paul or other anti-war candidates. That certainly happened. In the Iraq War, very to a great extent. I think he had more support. Yeah, he was actually the most popular candidate among U.S. military personnel. Yeah, which I found very, very interesting. So yeah, I think there's no question. You're probably finding a lot of those guys at the bases, have realized, maybe realized a while ago that their superiors really don't know what they're doing.
Something that worries me. Maybe there's no truth to this at all, but I was just thinking the fact that Trump survived that assassination. It was so close. It was miraculous that he survived. And that he's already got a big ego. We already know, he's a bit of a narcissist. That coupled with the fact that he survived this assassination attempt might be building a bit of a God complex within him. And maybe that's being fueled by the Zionists around him that know they can manipulate him and use it. It's like, look, you were meant to do great things. You were, to really have sort of feeding a bit of megalomania in him. Because we're seeing this talk about, making Canada the 51st state, taking Greenland. We can take Iran. Maybe we can take the oil fields. And he's got this way in his mind that he can recreate something and make America fantastic. He's unstoppable. He's anointed almost. And maybe all the Zionists and the Netanyahu administration kind of understand that and are able to feed into it, and it's helping them propel them down this path.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything to that's a
yeah? No, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of I think we're certainly seeing signs of megalomania. And I think actually the recent tariff announcement is an example of that. In fact, I don't think there are a whole lot of people pushing him to do this, probably very few. And this is something that just was in his own head. I mean, he's always had a preference for tariffs. And like I said, there can be arguments in favor of tariffs in certain cases. But this, this worldwide, Liberation Day that we've talked about. I mean, I think it's just something that sprang out of his head. And, even though the stock market is crashing or whatever, he seems to be he's very confident that it's going to work. And I don't think it's anything that anybody has been telling him, because there really isn't a faction for that kind of tariffs, certainly within the political class or, within the economic elite. I think it's another sign of kind of a, like you say, a megalomania, a kind of a, and it's worrying. It's one thing. This is a problem, or Trump embodies, let's say, in kind of rather extreme form, a trend that we've seen in the U.S. political system over the last few decades, and that is an increasing concentration in the power of the chief executive, the president. In the past, these executive orders were used very sparingly. If you go decades in the past, but over the years, presidents started to realize that this was a way to circumvent Congress. What they would do is invoke emergency powers. There's an emergency, and therefore I have made this order. And we saw Biden do that. We saw Obama and previous presidents do that. And I remember actually conservatives, expressing worry about the Democratic administration's use of these executive orders and saying, this isn't right. This should go through the legislature, through the Congress. But in the end, there really has been a bipartisan.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, there's been a bipartisan responsibility, for the expansion of executive orders, and now we have this person Trump, who maybe does believe he's on some sort of mission from God, or is just supremely self-confident. I'm not saying that he actually has this belief. I haven't seen any signs of that. He hasn't used that kind of language. But he's supremely self-confident. And maybe that self-confidence does come in part from, that assassination attempt. That was, his survival really was miraculous, or nearly miraculous. So he's got the supreme self-confidence, and he does see himself as a great leader, and believes very strongly that he's going to achieve great things. And now he finds this political system that has concentrated a lot of power in his hands, much more than, let's say, a president 20, 30, 40 years ago. He's got this power. He can just, invoke an emergency power and issue an executive order. And that's what we're seeing. Now, it may be that, the courts and Congress is not showing any signs of fighting back. Maybe the courts will, but potentially you might just ignore the courts. We'll see.
The crazy times. With these tariffs, there's a lot of talk that, this was a brilliant move by Trump, at least, from the Trump supporters, saying that this is forcing these countries to come to the negotiating table, that was the plan all along, that there's these massive tariffs and that they'll all line up and then they'll renegotiate and the U.S. will get a better deal. Is there any truth to that?
Well, we see some countries. I think I've heard something like 50 countries. We're talking about 170 countries in the world, something like that. 50 countries have approached the U.S. government and asked for a reduction in tariffs. And I guess, and part of that is, along with that request, is an offer to accommodate U.S. interests, U.S. trading interests. So we could see that in some cases. We did see that in the case, particularly of Mexico. Mexico didn't even really make any huge concessions, but did offer some. And Trump greatly reduced the tariffs on Mexico. But other countries, and the most important country of all is China. And no, they have not responded that way. They are fighting back. It says we're not going to grovel. We're not going to bend our knee. This is a real attack on us. And if you're going to wage war against us, we're just not going to sit down and take it. We're waging war back against you. And that's what they've already announced. All kinds of trade barriers were erected by China against the U.S.
Right. That was actually something I was going to bring up. Like, even if this was the case, at the end of the day, not all countries are equal. I think if China doesn't want to play ball, then the rest doesn't really matter. China is the most important one. So if China in itself, if it doesn't want to renegotiate these things, is fed up with it, and they said, we'll just sell our goods elsewhere. We'll slap on these reciprocal tariffs that you slapped on us, and we're not going to even bother with it. Then the whole plan would fail pretty much, right? I mean, nobody cares if you renegotiated something with Cote d'Ivoire or something. It doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, one of the danger here, again, I think that Trump has greatly overestimated the U.S. position. Again, I'm saying, we just account for something like a seventh of the world's market demand. An end result, if we put up all these barriers, against the whole world, well, the whole world, may just decide, well, let's trade with each other. We're 93% of the world. We're 95% of the world here. Let's just trade, among ourselves. And we end up just being the loser here. We're the one country that doesn't get these products, at a reasonable price.
I mean, if that happens, will we just see that the U.S. tanks while the rest of the world begins to stabilize?
There is a chance. Again, there are certain countries that are highly dependent on the U.S. We've already talked about Canada and Mexico, for obvious reasons, but I think you find other Latin American countries, and maybe I don't know, but maybe Vietnam is an example of that too. That's why they were slapped with such high tariffs. So it could be very painful for certain countries, but if you especially a country like Vietnam. It obviously can there are many other markets that it could develop, and I think there would be short-term pain, but there's no reason that they can't sell to Russia and China and all these other very large economies around them. Again, the total weight of these economies, the total size of these markets, really far exceeds the U.S. And maybe they had been geared towards the U.S. market, but they don't have to be. I think it may be more of a problem in the Western Hemisphere because, part of the reason that you were able to export competitively to the U.S. is that, you were closer to them. So transportation costs were lower. And it's not so easy to sell to people on the other side of the world. Though, I think you can exaggerate the difference. Again, container shipping is very, very efficient. And also you find in the case, I think, of the Western Hemisphere countries, the American, North American, South American countries, that the tariffs that have been imposed on them are in general not as high. I think a lot of them are simply 10%. So what we may see as a result of this is that there's just we do end up having a kind of like a different trading blocks, or at least the world might be divided into two hemispheres. We have a Western Hemisphere trading block, and then there's the rest of the world.
Interesting. All right, I want to go back a bit to what we saw happen in Yemen not too long ago. So Trump posted this tweet, and he said, "These Houthis gathered for instructions on attack. Oops, there will be no attack by these Houthis." And it showed a video of a bunch of people standing in a big circle.
Yeah.
And then we saw the footage, and boom, massive explosion. They're all gone. Can you tell me, what did that video show? What were we looking at?
Yeah, well, clearly it wasn't, some Houthi missile commanders standing in a circle outside. I mean, that's just absurd. Please, give me a break. Anybody look at that. And if Trump believes that that's what it was, then, that doesn't really speak very well of, Trump's judgment, let's just say, I don't know what it was. I've heard that it may have been some sort of ethnic, religious sort of event, something to mark the end of Ramadan. And, that makes a whole lot more sense to me than the idea that this was, that this is some sort of conference of the Houthi military. That doesn't make a bit of sense. I mean, really, why do you stand in a large circle like that outside? Does somebody make a decision and you whisper to the guy next to him and it goes around the circle or something? It's just beyond absurd.
Right. Now, that's what I saw as well. Most people were saying that this was, a celebration for the end of Ramadan, for the Eid festival. Which, if that's the case, because I believe that's true, and I haven't seen really anything to say to prove that this was some type of military gathering.
It could not have been.
Right.
Yeah.
But then it just struck me that how the president of the United States would show what is a war crime, and publicly, and the way that he tweeted about it, saying, "Oops, they're not like it really, it's been bothering me because I
Yeah,
remember when I was in college when the WikiLeaks came out, and I saw war footage from Iraq where U.S. soldiers were in helicopters and gunships
yeah,
and gunned down some people, and then an ambulance came to try to pick them up, and they gunned it down too.
right.
And there's maybe 10 people or something like this that were killed, and I was like, this is messed up. I can't believe that this is happening, and that was a big story
Right.
that this happened. That we saw this footage of a war crime committed by the United States in Iraq. And then here we are, just what 15 years later or so, and the president of the United States himself is tweeting it. We don't need Julian Assange to show it for us. Our president is showing it, and
Right. Right.
there's
Good point.
no there's no real there's just it just people accept it, and I just that's a worrying state of affairs for me. Like why how we've gotten to that point where we can just accept let's tweet out war crimes and laugh about it, and everybody's like, yeah, hoorah, when just 15 years ago we saw similar footage and we're like, this is horrible, this is a big problem, it was a big scandal, the WikiLeaks. Well, does it
Yeah.
just speak to just the moral degradation of our country?
Yeah, there's no question about it. There's clearly has been a steady lowering of ethical standards and an increasing callousness, and I really should say barbarism too. I mean, it certainly precedes the attack on Gaza, but I think it has been accelerated by the attack on Gaza and on Lebanon. And I think I made the point earlier. I mean, we're talking about how maybe this can really wake people up. And it certainly has had that effect on certain people within the West, in the US and in Europe, people that were kind of sitting on the fence, including a friend of mine. But after this, he says, oh God, this is genocide. They woke up to the horrors of the Israeli occupation and ethnic cleansing. But the problem is, that these horrors can also, there's always a danger, and I think what we're seeing this danger be realized right now, a danger of actually of which comes with complicity. If you don't stop and say, wait a second, this is wrong, and make a stand against it, you become complicit in the crimes. And with the complicity, there is a growing callousness. And you begin to adopt the mindset, of the perpetrators of these terrible crimes. And I think that's what we're seeing. Again, I think you're right. It's just actually things happen every day now that would have caused a huge reaction in the past. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, no question about it. Or, like you say, 15 years ago, too. But now, in general, there's silence. There's just the chirping of crickets, or there's outright applause. Like in the case of the pager attacks, where it's just celebrated, by so many people among supporters of Israel.
Right. It seems like we've just learned to close our hearts and minds to these atrocities. And there might be a problem with just the fact that if you keep on doing it and nothing has happened, you just kind of get acclimated to it. Like the footage coming out of Gaza is just so horrific. I just saw footage yesterday of where they bombed a journalist tent and a guy's being burned alive. And it's just like, oh my goodness. And then you see, just children missing a head or limbs, toddlers. And they use this language like, oh, we eliminated, I think, a 2-year-old that they said is the grandson of some Hamas official or something. They use the word, we eliminated him. And he's a two-year-old boy. What is going on? And then it just keeps on coming out and nothing happens. And then the more that it keeps coming out and that they realize that nobody's doing anything except the Houthis, that, we can just keep on that. You have to push through. And like you said, maybe there's that idea, that callousness. Once you have a certain amount of blood on your hand, you can't look back and say like, oh, I was rooting for a genocide and I was supporting this. You have to just really close yourself off and be like, we got to do this. These people are evil. They're Amalek. We will adopt the Israeli the point of view on this, and
Right.
they just all of them must be exterminated. There are no innocents, and it's horrifying. It's just so horrifying that it's happening today, this day and age, when we can
Right.
see it. Like the atrocities that happened in World War II, they weren't being broadcast to the world, and but here they are, and we're not doing anything. It's
Yeah. No, it is horrifying. I mean, it's interesting. One exception to this trend is the story about the horrifying story of the different rescue workers that were killed, deliberately murdered
I heard that
by the
footage.
IDF. Right. But what happened? I mean, so first they were getting reports from the Palestinians that this had happened. The IDF just denied it, or they said, okay, well, there were some emergency vehicles, but they didn't have their lights on and they were behaving suspiciously. But then, these bodies were dug up. First of all, let's say that they were buried, and then and their emergency vehicles were buried, or at least partially had been crushed and then buried next to them. So, I mean, this was clearly an attempt to cover up a crime. How else can you explain this? One of the bodies, they found a phone. It was like one of the victims had actually been filming, the incident before he was killed himself. I mean, it's very, very hard. I didn't listen to it, but I've heard it's very, very hard to listen.
I listened to it. It was
okay.
very difficult to listen to.
Yeah, because at the end, he knew that he was going to be killed too. And he's just sort of like trying to make his peace with God and with this, his loved ones. Since he knew that his end was near. And they found, there was a bullet in his brain. But I guess before they killed him, he put his phone in his pocket, and then that was recovered. Now, the thing, this is a horrible, horrible, horrible atrocity. But what makes it different is that this one actually is getting coverage in the U.S. It was reported in the New York Times and in the Guardian in Britain. I've actually, I read the whole Guardian article. They didn't pull any punches. They described the whole timeline. It's even, more horrible than I've described. So, yeah, this is an exception. Now, things like this happen, unfortunately, all the time. Again, there have been, you mentioned the journalists, there have been more journalists killed in Gaza than in all of World War II. I mean, it's clear that it's been deliberate. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, medical workers that have been killed. The entire hospital's destroyed. This is something that goes on. But this one incident actually, has been reported. And the other ones have been just ignored or downplayed or, kind of presented with a lot of spin. It's complicated or whatever, even when it wasn't complicated. So that's interesting that happened. It may just, it's hard for me to, you can hope, maybe in some case, some of these people, these journalists that have been working for these mainstream organizations, they've seen enough and they're starting to report it. That
They're journalists themselves. When they see journalists getting killed, you think like, whoa, this isn't okay, right? They're burning this journalist alive. That's
right.
Shouldn't I have my duty to report it? Or be like, it's Hamas's fault. I'm so sick of that. Everything is Hamas's fault.
Right.
Like, who's dropping the bombs? Who's killing the women and children?
Here you just had irrefutable proof, and it just couldn't. The IDF just keeps on backtracking. Now they admit, okay, because the footage showed that the lights were on and the vehicles were clearly marked and whatever. So the IDF had been lying. They were caught in a lie, but then they came up with other lies, and they've been caught in those too. And now, so Israel in this case is forced to say, there's something, clearly somebody made some mistakes and we'll investigate, which they always say. And at the most, somebody's going to get a slap on the wrist and the whole thing will be forgotten, unfortunately. If past history is a guide, again, just the fact that this report was reported was really unusual. And, but I have to say that's a little glimmer, an example of, maybe the horrors of waking certain people up. Let's hope so. You could have a more cynical analysis, and it may be that they just letting this out because there is a lot of anger directed at Netanyahu. There's no question about it. And his breaking of the ceasefire, because that also ended the hostage deal. So you find there's a lot of anger within Israel against Netanyahu, and also against Netanyahu outside of Israel as well. So maybe the cynical point of view, and I guess I'm not going to argue this. I think that like those reporters, they just reported honestly, and they themselves were horrified. But there could be people that use this just against Netanyahu, and then once they get Netanyahu out of there, then things will continue. I know that's cynical, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be cynical here.
Yeah. And what worries me a bit is that if Trump is just completely hook, line, and sinker is bought into the Israeli narrative and just full Zionist, will never, talk about these atrocities and crimes that Israel is perpetrating on the Palestinians, that so many Americans that have put all their faith in Trump will just go with him hook, line, and sinker as well. Yeah. Because he has such a cold personality with him that many people have just abdicated all of their critical thinking skills, empathy, whatever. It's all, so they put their soul into Trump, and Trump is their savior. And, that's it. So anything he says, he's infallible. And they can't separate the man from his policies. Just like, let's look at everything he's doing. If you like some of the Doge stuff, great. But were you America first? How is this what we're seeing in Gaza, America first? How is what we're seeing in Yemen, America first, or Iran? And there just seems to be this inability for so many people that have just, everything, just the whole story of Trump over the past 10 years has just been wild. And so he has been elevated into this, this huge figure, which we talked about before, just sort of fueling into his megalomania. And the assassination attempt, the lawfare against him, everything. I understand where a lot of people are just furious at everything that's been thrown at Trump before, and they want to put everything behind him. And that's what worries me, because I think a lot of these people are not necessarily bad people, but they have decided just to be like, whatever Trump does, that's our leader. He's our new Jesus. That's what it is. And that's a scary thing for me. And I feel like he'll always have that support, which will keep him moving forward on some of these things.
Yeah. No, I think you're correct. I don't disagree.
Okay, well, let me try to pivot over a little bit to Russia-Ukraine. We haven't talked about it much in a while. You were saying this talk about a major Russian offensive. I want to dive into that a bit more, because right before going to bed last night, I saw Alexander Mercouris had a new episode out, and it had said major Russian offensive or something like that on it. I was like, this is going to be interesting. And I clicked it, and he put me to sleep in 3 minutes. So I didn't get to finish it. He always does that. I'm always like, oh man, I love listening to him, but I always fall asleep. So.
Yeah, something about his voice that puts one quickly to sleep. Yeah, I discovered the same thing.
Yeah.
Though I think a viewer said the same thing about me.
Yeah, people say the same thing about you. People say the same thing about you too. So that's not a bad thing. That means you're soothing, that people like to listen. But
yeah. Well, I actually did listen to that episode on a walk, so I couldn't fall asleep. And I think that the headline was kind of clickbait, because he didn't, at least as far as I could tell, he didn't present evidence of that. I guess he was saying that there has been an acceleration. There have been major advances, significant advances, along the battle lines in the last few days, and that's true. But it doesn't amount to anything like a big air offensive. I think the places where we're seeing the most significant advances are the Kupiansk area. We've talked about that bridgehead. The Russians crossed the Oskol River, and they are just taking a very large swath of territory on the other side of the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk. And that's been true for the last couple of months. That's one area where things really never slowed down, and they continue to make very impressive advances there. And then I think also somewhere in the Liman area, that's south of Kupiansk. And then the third area where is the southern or southwestern Donetsk. And I think I've mentioned that. That's the place where they really have moved beyond the fortification lines, and they're entering the steppe, heading towards the Dnieper. And so they've made steady, nothing really dramatic, but it's just like every day a village, something is taken in that area. And then the fourth place is down is Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye, is in the south, and they're actually rather than heading west, they're heading north there. towards Zaporozhye city. But before they get to Zaporozhye city, they'll have to take this town. I forget the name at the moment. It was the base. It was the logistical base for the big summer 2023 offensive. It's their staging area. And I know that the Russians pounded it a lot, because that's where the Ukrainians would assemble their armor and, other equipment. But they're on the verge of taking that. And then after that, it's kind of just an open march to the city of Zaporozhye, which is a major city, which the Russians have declared, unequivocally that this is something they are going to take. Either, the Ukrainians are going to give it to them or they're going to take it. So that's one of I think, the major candidates for an offensive. If indeed this talk about an offensive turns out to be true, I think Zaporozhye is one place where we might see it. But another, again, I think there's the Ukrainians themselves have said that they've seen a real increase in forces in the Kupiansk area. So we may see something there in the Kharkov region.
Okay. Also, in the last episode we did, you mentioned that 75% of the Russian casualties inflicted by the Ukrainians were done so by drones.
Right.
I'm wondering, where did you get those numbers? Where do you...
I believe I got that actually from Simplicius the Thinker.
Okay.
Who I found to be good. Everybody makes mistakes, but he's really good on that kind of stuff. And he's been consistently reliable. He's not somebody who, if anything, he's sort of kind of a pessimist. I think he's sometimes even a little too quick to give credence to, anti-Russian arguments. He's clearly pro-Russian, but he's not one of these guys that, assumes that the Russians are invincible or, whatever. He does show a lot of respect for the Ukrainian armed forces. That's what he said. He said 75% of all Russian casualties are caused by drones, but maybe just 30 to 50% of Ukrainian. And again, for the reason that I gave, it's just because the Russians don't just rely entirely on drones. But you can see that drones have really kept the Ukrainians in the fight. If they didn't have drones, I think it would have been over a while ago. But drones is something they still have, and that the Russians have to be very careful about. It's really quite remarkable, what both sides have to come up with all kinds of innovations. Often just jury rigged right there on the front lines to deal with the drone problem, because this is something new. It's like. Nobody was really prepared for the role of drones in warfare, but now clearly they play a very, very important role. How do you counter them? One thing, we've seen these, what do they call them? Like these big turtle or kind of like rolling sheds. I saw some footage of what it was is basically a tank with a big metal shed on top of it. And then on top of the metal shed, there were some EW units. And it looks very ungainly. It was Russian, but it worked. That's the thing, is that it actually worked. And the Russians were actually, I think, up on top of the tank. They said, actually learn it's safer. It's like if you're EW or you have your other sensors, if it tells you that that a drone is about to hit, you can get out of there quickly. You open the door to the shed and just run. But if you're in a tank, it's very, very hard to get out. And so actually there can be more casualties inside the tank, if you don't have the shed on the top of it. So this is, again, it just looks really kind of primitive, but it worked. They were able to get to the trenches, the Ukrainian trenches, jump out and seize the Ukrainian positions. It was actually, and I'm sure that like the Russian, the guys back at whatever the military design institutes or whatever are looking at this and saying, okay, we got to redesign our tanks. These guys have done great, but we should be producing things in the factory that have these added features.
Mm. Yeah, I think something that a lot of people don't really take in consideration is how this Ukraine war has really strengthened the Russian military in terms of that it has learned how to counter all of the traditional uh, conventional weapons that the United States has. And I don't know if the U.S. has really fully understood that. And then this just means that by proxy that Iran will also know how to counter a lot of U.S. Weaponry if there's ever an attack on Iran, and that this was supposed to be a weapons laboratory. That was one of the arguments made by NATO. Oh, we can experiment, but we don't see that much development or evolution in military technology on the NATO side. But we're seeing a lot come out from Russia.
Yeah. I think, recently there was one, I haven't heard anything about it. I don't know if these weapons have actually been used so far, but those are the small diameter glide bombs.
Right.
Apparently, because those were introduced to great fanfare, I remember a couple of years ago, and there was, like everything else, is supposed to be a game changer. But almost immediately, the Russians figured out how to neutralize them. They're dependent, I think, on GPS, and they could just shut that down, block those signals. And it turned out that these weapons were just entirely useless. So, the Ukrainians tried them for a couple of weeks and then said, yeah, this is just junk. We can't do anything with this. Completely neutralized by the Russians. So the Americans did, at least this is what has been reported. They went back to the drawing board and then they redesigned it, these weapons in a way that's supposed to make them impervious to or highly resistant to Russian EW. And we'll see, because I haven't heard anything about their use. So, maybe they haven't arrived at the front lines yet. We'll see how they do. But that would be one example where the U.S. military equipment evolved.
Took them 3 years and we haven't seen it in action yet. Maybe it has. And I just have a feeling that even if they do, I feel like the Russians will figure out a way to work around it,
Maybe.
We'll see.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I saw... just speaking about drones, just a last little thing is there's Patrick Lancaster. I don't know if you saw this. He was in the back of a pickup truck in Kursk, and a drone spotted them and started chasing him down. He was back there with two other Russians, and they used shotguns.
Yeah.
And just started firing. I think one of them had a rifle, a semi-automatic rifle, and the other one was a shotgun. And it was an intense moment. Patrick was like, "Oh my god!" And then, but they got it. They shot it down. So it's just interesting to see that. Sort of these old 12 gauge shotguns are kind of being revived in this war. Because, it makes sense. It's like a bird. You want to scatter shot, take that thing down.
Right.
But yeah, it was a scary moment. But those guys shooting at it were incredibly chill about the whole thing. It was
probably not the first time they've done it.
Right. Probably not the first time. It's like, wow. Right. It's a new scary age of war, and we're just talking about it seems like the U.S. wants more of it. The one thing that I feel like might save the world is that if we do start a major war with Iran or things go south in Ukraine, is that we'll try to turn on our military engine and it just won't start because we're already very depleted from my understanding. Even just through the Houthis, there's talks about where we are depleting our munitions for our Navy. We can't do this much longer, which is insane. And then, so we'll just try to do this. We'll try to get conscript people. There's going to be people are like, what are we doing? Let's stop. And so that's my hope is that if things do really go south in Iran or in Ukraine, that there will be enough common sense amongst the people in the West that says, this is madness. What are we doing? I'm not signing up. You can't even produce the weapons, so what are we doing here?
Yeah. Right. Well, there's a hope. And I've said the same thing about Europe, because the European military is in even sorrier condition. And, there obviously there's a lot of war talk in Europe, but it's empty because they just don't have the means. And that may be what prevents a world war from happening there. It's just when it comes down to it, when a president issues a command, the generals will tell him, yeah, we don't have any tanks. We don't have any howitzers. I'm sorry, it's just not going to work, my friend. And that may be, it's just reality will put a brake on it. Maybe in the case of the U.S., the U.S. military is certainly more powerful and does have more, many more munitions than the Europeans. But yeah, those stockpiles have been depleted, and we have, we're aware of the limitations. You're just talking about the Houthis. It was actually under Biden that they, Trump accuses Biden of, somehow of being soft, but they pounded the Houthis too, and to the point where they actually just ran out of missiles, and the ships had to go back to port to reload because they can't reload at sea. And it probably the same thing's going to happen to the fleet under Trump. I think that's what we're seeing.
Right. Okay. Well, let's end it there then, Dad.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.